Tuesday morning didn't feel different at first. That's the thing about moments that change your life, you never feel them arriving. I was halfway through making coffee when I noticed the envelope in the mailbox. Thick paper, certified stamp, neat handwriting. No urgency in it, no warning, just control disguised as paperwork. I almost didn't open it right away. Something about it felt unnecessary, like the kind of letter you already know you're not going to like. But I opened it anyway. And by the third line, my hand stopped moving. You are hereby required to list your property for sale within 72 hours. I read it again, then again, because the brain doesn't accept that kind of sentence immediately. It tries to reinterpret it into something less insane, a misunderstanding, a mistake, a bluff, but the words didn't change. 72 hours. Sell the cabin I built with my own hands, or face $500 per day in fines until enforcement and lien proceedings begin. No court order attached, no hearing, no judge, no process I could point to and say, this is where they went wrong. Just a signature at the bottom. Pet Voss HOA enforcement chair. I stood there on the porch longer than I should have, holding that paper like it might reformat itself if I gave it enough time. The wind moved through the trees behind the cabin. Not strong wind, just enough to make the branches shift and creak. It sounded normal. That's what made it worse, because nothing around me had changed. The creek still ran. The forest still stood. The land didn't react. Only the paper did, and somehow that made it feel more real than anything else. I wasn't angry yet, not properly, not in a way that had direction. I was just aware that something had crossed a line it shouldn't have been able to cross. My name is Garrett Holt, retired civil engineer. 30 years working on roads, drainage systems, land layouts, anything that involved ground, structure, and consequence. And if there's one thing that job teaches you, early, it's this: land doesn't lie. People do. But land keeps receipts. I inherited 11 acres in the Blue Ridge from my father in 2009 when he passed away. He bought it in 1974, back when that part of the mountains still belonged mostly to silence and old logging paths. He wasn't a developer, not a businessman. Just a man who wanted space that didn't ask him for anything. The property had a creek cutting through it. Hardwood forest that had been growing longer than most people's families had lived in the region. And a collapsing structure that used to be a hunting cabin before time and neglect turned it into something barely standing. Most people would have torn it down. But I didn't see something broken. I saw something unfinished, and I started rebuilding it myself. 3 summers. No contractors, no crew. Just sawdust, steel, and repetition. I poured the foundation by hand, ran conduit correctly, installed septic the way it was meant to be done, not the way it's usually rushed through. I milled cedar from trees on the property itself, board by board. There's a smell fresh cut cedar gives off in summer heat that never leaves you. It's not just wood. It's heat and oil and time compressed into something physical. By 2013, the cabin stood finished. 1,400 square feet. Simple, strong, quiet. Worth maybe $160,000 on paper if someone needed a number, but numbers were never the point. The point was that every inch of it had passed through my hands, and things like that don't feel replaceable. Whitmore Ridge wasn't supposed to be complicated. It wasn't even a town. Just a stretch of land connected by a gravel road and mutual understanding between a handful of property owners. For years, there was no HOA, no enforcement, no system. Just people maintaining their own land and sharing responsibility for the road when it needed gravel or repair. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Then a developer named Cresswell Danning bought land nearby. He built spec cabins, clean, designs, modern finishes, the kind of places that look good in photos and forgettable in real life. Short-term rentals, investment units, inventory dressed up as community. And then came paperwork, the HOA, Whitmore Ridge Homeowners Association, formed in 2017. At first it sounded harmless: organization, coordination, maintenance structure. But structure always becomes something else when someone decides they control it. That's when I first heard the name, Pet Voss, HOA enforcement chair, not elected in any way that mattered. Just present at the beginning, positioned correctly, and confident enough to stay there. She drove a white Escalade with an HOA board sticker on the back window. Not official, self-made, which told you more about her than any biography could. Her version of order had edges, and anything outside those edges didn't stay untouched for long. The first time she interacted with my property, it wasn't direct. It was a note on my windshield. Wood piles must not be visible from roadway. No law cited. No rule referenced. Just instruction, as if instruction alone creates obligation. I ignored it. A week later, another note appeared, then another. Each one slightly more certain, slightly less polite. The pattern was obvious even then. This wasn't communication, it was conditioning. So I responded the only way I knew how. I wrote a letter. I explained that my property predates the HOA, that I never signed anything, that I was not subject to their covenants or enforcement structure, and I ended it politely. I even meant it. Then I went back to work. I assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The certified letter changed the tone completely. No more notes, no more informal language. Now it was fines, deadlines, legal language copied just well enough to sound real. Sell in 72 hours. Or daily penalties, or lien action. Pressure stacked in a way designed for one outcome: compliance through exhaustion. It wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a push. And pushes only work when the person being pushed doesn't understand what's under their feet. I stood on the porch after reading it, listening to the creak behind the cabin. That sound never changes. It just exists, steady and indifferent. And I realized something I didn't like admitting at first. This wasn't about rules. It was about perception. They didn't think I would resist properly. They thought I would react emotionally. Hire a lawyer fast, panic, sell. Because that's what most people do when paperwork gets aggressive enough. But I didn't move. I've spent too many years reading plans, contracts, and land systems to mistake pressure for authority. So instead of responding, I drove down to the county recorder's office. Not because I thought I would find a solution there, because I wanted to see what they were relying on. The building smelled like old paper and fluorescent lighting. Quiet, slow, indifferent in the way government offices always are. I pulled every file connected to Whitmore Ridge. Deeds, covenants, amendments. I sat there for hours, and what I found was simple. My property was never formally annexed into the HOA jurisdiction. No signature, no consent, no legal binding entry. Which meant something very important. They were enforcing rules on someone who was never inside their system. That alone would have ended most of it. But then I kept reading, and I found something else. The HOA office parceled the place where they met, stored records, ran everything was delinquent on property taxes. 14 months behind, public record. Unresolved, unnoticed. I closed the folder slowly, because that's the moment the situation stopped being one-sided. Not emotionally, structurally. I didn't do anything with it yet. I just wrote a note to myself. Fine leverage they didn't realize they exposed. And for the first time since that letter arrived, I stopped feeling like the one being cornered, and started wondering what else they had left unprotected. Because systems like this don't usually fail loudly. They fail where no one bothered to look, and I had just started looking. The next morning, I made a phone call that I probably should have made sooner. And what I learned on that call changed the entire direction of everything that followed. I made the call early the next morning. Not because I needed urgency, but because I needed clarity before emotion had time to interfere. The person I called was Weston Bramble, real estate attorney. Someone I'd worked with years ago on a road easement dispute that had turned into a documentation nightmare. He had the kind of voice that never rushed, even when the situation did. He answered on the third ring. "Garrett," he said, like he was picking up a conversation we had paused yesterday instead of years ago. "I've got something," I told him. I explained the letter first. The 72-hour demand, the fines, the lien threat, the signature from an HOA enforcement chair acting like she had court authority built into her handwriting. He didn't interrupt once. That was the first sign he understood this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "They're trying to force a sale on a non-member property. That's what it looks like. It's not just improper," he said slowly. "It's aggressive overreach. But I need to see the recorded covenants. All of them. I already pulled them." "Good," he said. "Bring them in." So I did. The county recorder's office always feels like it exists outside of time. Not fast. Not slow. Just fixed. The smell of paper and ink. The low hum of fluorescent lights. The sound of folders being moved like decisions being weighed instead of stored. I sat at a long table with Weston beside me as he flipped through the documents. He didn't speak for a while. That's something I've learned about lawyers like him. Silence isn't confusion. It's mapping. Then he stopped on a page and tapped it lightly. This is your property? He asked. Yes. Was it ever annexed into the HOA? No. He nodded once. Then you're not bound by the CC and RS. He kept reading anyway. And that's when I saw his expression change, not dramatically, just slightly, like someone noticing a crack in a structure they expected to be solid. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the page back and scanned it again. Then he said, they're acting like they have jurisdiction over land they never legally acquired authority over. That's the letter. No, he said. The letter is noise. The problem is they believe it. That distinction mattered more than it should have, because noise can be ignored. Belief is what drives escalation. We spent the next hour breaking it down properly. The HOA had been formed in 2017. The covenants recorded in 2018. But my property had been purchased long before that. No sale after recording. No consent agreement. No voluntary inclusion. In legal terms, it meant something simple. I was outside their system, and they were still trying to enforce it anyway. Weston leaned back in his chair. If this goes where I think it's going, he said, they're not going to stop with letters. What do you mean? They'll escalate pressure, fines, liens, maybe even nuisance claims. Not because they're right, but because that's how enforcement groups behave when they don't get immediate compliance. I looked at the paper stack. So they're betting I fold before I understand it. He nodded. Most people do. That was the first time the situation stopped feeling theoretical. Because I wasn't most people. And whoever was behind this letter either didn't know that or didn't care. On the drive back, I kept thinking about something Weston said. They believe they have jurisdiction. Belief creates behavior. And behavior creates risk. The problem wasn't just that they were wrong. It was that they were confident. And confident people don't pause before escalation. They accelerate. When I got home, the wind had picked up slightly. Not enough to be loud, just enough to move the trees in slow waves behind the cabin. The same wind, the same land. But the situation didn't feel the same anymore. Because now I knew this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a system. And systems don't usually apologize. They double down. The next message came 3 days later. Not from the HOA directly. From the county. A separate complaint had been filed against my property. Unpermitted structure. The tool shed. I almost laughed when I saw it. Because I knew that it had been built by my father in 1987. Long before permit requirements for structures under 200 square feet existed in that county. Which meant it was exempt. Still, the complaint was official enough to trigger inspection. So I called the county office. The inspector who answered sounded tired before I even spoke. I explained the situation. There was a pause while he checked the records. Then he said, yeah, I see it. This is exempt, not even close to a violation. So it's closed. It was closed the moment it was opened, he said. You're fine. And then he added something that stuck with me. People file these kinds of complaints when they're trying to build pressure, not solve problems. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen longer than I needed to. Because now the pattern was visible. This wasn't enforcement. It was attrition. If they couldn't win directly, they would exhaust everything around me until I made the decision for them. Time, energy, money, attention. They were trying to turn resistance into cost. And most people eventually choose the cheaper option. But I wasn't most people. Still, understanding that didn't make it less dangerous. It made it more structured, which meant it could be answered. I opened my laptop and pulled up the county GIS map. Not looking for answers yet. Just mapping what existed. That's when I saw the HOA office parcel clearly for the first time. Small, simple, single structure, parking area, mail cluster, and a red flag I hadn't focused on before. Property taxes, 14 months delinquent. Public record, unresolved. A system that enforces rules on others, but forgets to maintain itself, isn't stable. It's vulnerable. I leaned back in my chair. And for the first time since that letter arrived, I stopped thinking about defense and started thinking about structure. Because if they were going to turn this into pressure, then somewhere in their system, there had to be something that didn't hold under weight. And all I had to do was find where they forgot to tighten it. The next step wasn't legal. It wasn't emotional. It was informational. And what I found next was the first real mistake they had made. I didn't act on it immediately. That's something people misunderstand about situations like this. The advantage doesn't come from moving fast. It comes from knowing exactly when not to. So I let a few days pass. During that time, nothing slowed down on their side. If anything, it escalated. Another notice appeared on my gatepost. Then a second certified letter arrived. This one had more legal language, more references to ongoing non-compliance, and a tone that was trying harder to sound final than the first one had. Sell the property. Stop the fines. Avoid lien action. Same structure. Just louder. But the pattern was the same underneath it. Pressure, repeated. Not resolution. I kept both letters on the kitchen table, not because I was considering them, because I wanted to see them long enough that they stopped feeling like authority and started feeling like behavior. And behavior can be studied. Weston called me that Thursday afternoon. I pulled something, he said without greeting. That sounds like trouble. It depends on which side you're on. I didn't respond immediately. He continued. The HOA office parcel you were right. It's delinquent on property taxes, but there's more than that. What more? There's a recorded contractor lien on the property. That got my attention. Who? A contractor named Burl Arian. Parking lot construction. 2019. I leaned forward slightly. And they didn't pay him? No, Weston said. And he filed properly, which means it's enforceable. There was a pause. Then he added, they've been sitting on it for years. I looked at the map again in my head. A small office parcel, a governing structure built on a physical location, and a financial obligation attached to it that they had ignored long enough to make it real. So they're exposed, I said. Yes, Weston replied, but not just financially. That's when I understood where he was going. Control point, I said. Exactly. He explained it slowly, like he was laying out a diagram. A mechanic's lien is not just debt, it's leverage against property. If it's valid, recorded, and unresolved, it sits on top of ownership like weight. And if ownership tries to move forward without addressing it, it doesn't disappear, it follows. I asked the obvious question, can it be bought? There was a pause on the line. Then Weston said, yes. That single word changed the shape of everything. Because now it wasn't just a dispute, it was a structure with a pressure point that could be transferred. I'll call you back, he said. Let me check something. He hung up. And for the first time, I realized something important. Weston wasn't just reacting anymore. He was calculating, which meant he saw the same thing I did. Just more clearly. The next morning he called again. I spoke to the contractor, he said. Still involved? Not really. He's been trying to collect for years. At this point, he just wants out. And he's willing to sell the lien. I didn't ask the price immediately, because I already understood the direction this was going. How much? I asked. 5,000. I looked out the window toward the creek. Same water, same sound, same movement it always had. But the situation around it wasn't the same anymore. Because now there was something I could actually hold. Not emotion, not argument, position. Do it, I said. Weston didn't hesitate. I'll draft the assignment. The transaction didn't feel dramatic. That's another thing people get wrong. Nothing changes when leverage is acquired. Not immediately. There's no sound, no signal, no visible shift in the world, just paperwork moving from one name to another. A week later, I was the holder of a recorded mechanic's lien against the HOA's office parcel. Not metaphorically, legally, which meant something simple. They owed someone, and that obligation now pointed at me. I didn't tell anyone. Not neighbors, not the HOA, not even the people who had been quietly watching the situation unfold. Because leverage only works when it's not advertised. The moment people know it exists, they start planning around it. So I kept it quiet and waited. That's when the HOA made its next mistake. They stopped focusing on the property and started focusing on me. It began with something small. A community inspection walkthrough. That's what they called it. 5 board members walking the perimeter of my land, taking photos from the road easement. Legally allowed, strategically pointless. I watched from the porch as they moved along the boundary. Pet Voss was at the front, white Escalade parked further down the road like it was part of the landscape. She didn't look at me directly, but she didn't have to. The intention was obvious. Document. Collect. Build pressure. Make me feel observed. Make me feel surrounded. One of the board members, a man named Forsyth, looked up at me briefly, just long enough for eye contact. Then he looked away like it burned. I gave him a small wave. Not mocking, not friendly, just acknowledgement. He didn't wave back. He didn't need to. He already knew he was on the wrong side of something. 2 days later, another county complaint appeared. This time, fire hazard, my woodpile. The same woodpile that had been there for years. The same woodpile that had been measured before. The same woodpile that had already been cleared. The fire marshal came out within the week, measured it again. 17 feet from the road. Requirement is 6. He closed the file before he left the property. No violation. No action. Just paperwork confirming reality hadn't changed. When he left, he said something under his breath that I didn't forget. Some people don't file complaints to fix things. They file them to stay busy. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, because it described the pattern perfectly. This wasn't enforcement. It was noise generation. And noise generation only serves one purpose: to make clarity harder to hold on to. Weston called again that evening. His tone had shifted slightly, not alarmed, but more focused. They're escalating internally, he said. What does that mean? Emergency board meeting, they've discovered the lien. I leaned back in my chair. So now they know. Now they know, he repeated. A pause. Then he added, and they don't know what you're going to do with it. That was the important part. Knowledge creates fear when it arrives late, because now every assumption they had built their strategy on was no longer valid. I looked out at the ridge as the sun started dropping behind the trees. The shadows stretched longer across the ground, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was reacting to them anymore. I felt like I was waiting for them to react to me. And that shift is where most conflicts stop being equal, because one side is still pushing forward blindly, while the other side has already started reading the structure underneath it. And structures always tell you where they break. The only question now was when they would realize I was already standing next to the weak point. The first sign that something had changed wasn't a letter. It was silence. No new notices. On my gate. No fresh certified mail. No follow-up complaints from the county. Just nothing. And in situations like this, nothing is never peace. It's preparation. I could feel it in the way the ridge seemed quieter than usual, like even the wind had stopped committing to movement. Weston called me that evening. They've gone internal, he said. Meaning what exactly? Emergency HOA board meeting, closed session. The lien is on the agenda. I didn't respond right away, because I already knew what that meant. When people realize they can't pressure you directly, Weston continued, they start reorganizing the pressure. So this is escalation. Yes, he said, but not outward. Structural. That word mattered. Structural meant decisions were being made without visibility, which meant they were trying to regain control before the situation stopped being theirs to manage. I asked him the question I'd been waiting to ask. If they try to pay it off, there was a pause on the line. They can, he said, but that requires liquidity. And from what I've seen of their books, they're not sitting on surplus cash, so they're exposed. In a way, he said carefully. Yes. But exposure doesn't automatically create compliance. That was the problem. People don't always behave logically when they're cornered. They behave emotionally, and emotional decisions inside systems like HOAs tend to be expensive. I need you to understand something, Weston added. They don't just see this as a lien. They see it as a challenge to authority. That's because it is, I said. No, he corrected. It's a financial instrument. But they're not thinking like accountants right now. They're thinking like enforcers. That distinction stayed with me after the call ended. Because accountants solve, enforcers react, and reaction is where mistakes happen. The next morning, I saw the first visible sign of their internal shift. A new vehicle at the entrance road. Not HOA. County sheriff, parked, casually near the gravel turnoff like it belonged there. I didn't go down immediately. I watched from the porch instead. 2 people speaking, no urgency in their posture, just conversation. That alone told me something important. If this had been criminal, it would have moved differently. If this had been urgent, there would have been urgency. But this was neither. This was procedural curiosity. After a while, the deputy left. No sirens, no confrontation, just departure. And that meant one thing. They were still trying to understand what they were dealing with. Not punish it, not resolve it, understand it, which gave me time. Weston called again that afternoon. I got something, he said. You keep saying that. This one's different. I could hear papers moving in the background. Talk to me, I said. The HOA board minutes leaked internally. Not officially, but someone forwarded me a summary. And they're debating whether to settle the lien or challenge its validity. I leaned forward slightly. Can they challenge it? They can try, he said, but it's properly recorded. Contractor signature is valid. Work was completed. Payment wasn't made. So legally? Legally, he said. They're standing on weak ground. A pause. Then he added, but that's not what matters to them. I already knew what was coming. What matters is control perception, I said. Exactly. That night, I sat outside longer than usual. The creak was louder now because the air had cooled. Sound carries differently when temperature drops. Everything feels closer. The cabin behind me was quiet. No lights except the porch. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't actively solving anything. I was just observing the shape of it. Because something had become clear. This wasn't a dispute anymore. It was a system testing its own authority. And systems like that don't stop when they become uncertain. They accelerate until something forces them to stop. The only question was what that something would be. 2 days later, I got the answer. Not directly, indirectly. From a neighbor, Struther. He came up the gravel path in the late afternoon, hands in his jacket pockets, looking like someone who wasn't entirely sure why he was there but knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. You got a minute? He asked. I nodded, toward the porch. He sat down slowly. She's telling people you're trying to destroy property values, he said. I didn't react. That wasn't new. And? I asked. And she's saying the lien thing is illegal, he continued, that you somehow manufactured it. I nodded once. That part was expected too. People rewrite stories when they feel losing control. She's trying to rally support, he added. That's not support, I said. That's deflection. He looked at me for a moment, then said something quieter. People are starting to pick sides. I leaned back in my chair. That's what happens when someone loses control of the narrative. He hesitated, then stood up like he had said what he came to say. Before he left, he added one more thing. Just don't underestimate how far she's willing to push this. I watched him walk, back down the path, and I believed him, not because I was worried, but because I understood something important now. People like her don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when they're forced to stop. That same night, Weston called again. His voice was different this time, not alarmed, but fully focused. They filed something, he said. What kind of something? A civil complaint. I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was, the formal escalation. They're trying to force compliance through court pressure, he continued. It's weak, but it changes the stage. How? Now it's no longer informal enforcement. It's documented litigation posture. I stood up and walked toward the window. And what does that mean practically? It means, he said slowly, they're trying to turn perception into authority. A pause. Then he added, and they're hoping you respond emotionally. I looked out at the dark ridge. No, I said quietly. They're hoping I respond predictably. Weston didn't answer immediately, because he understood the difference. Predictable behavior is what systems rely on. If you can predict the response, you can control the outcome. But unpredictability in legal systems doesn't mean chaos. It means timing. And timing is where leverage lives. They're planning something for the upcoming HOA meeting, Weston said after a moment. I already knew that too. So am I said. There was a pause. A longer one this time. Then Weston said, then we need to be very precise about when this shifts. I know, I said. And I hung up. Because at that point, I wasn't watching what they were doing anymore. I was waiting for the moment they would finally show me everything they had been hiding. And that moment was already getting close. The week before the meeting, everything changed in tone, not speed, not intensity, tone. Because now the situation wasn't expanding outward anymore. It was tightening inward. The HOA stopped sending individual notices and shifted to something more coordinated. A community update, that's what they called it, printed on glossy paper, distributed to every mailbox cluster on the ridge. It didn't mention me directly at first. It didn't have to. It talked about external interference, property value protection, and uncooperative adjacent land behavior. Carefully chosen phrases. The kind that sound neutral until you realize they're pointing at someone without naming them. I read it once. Then I folded it and left it on the table. Because at that point, reacting to language like that was no longer useful. Language wasn't the real tool anymore. It was just preparation. Weston called me that evening. They're building a narrative, he said. I noticed this is pre-meeting positioning, he continued. They're trying to frame you before anything is said in a formal setting, so they're preparing the room. Yes, he said. They want the room to already agree before you walk in. That was the part most people miss about conflicts like this. The outcome isn't decided in the meeting. It's decided in what people believe before they enter it. What are our options? I asked. There was a pause. Then Weston said, we stop reacting to their framing. We change the structure of what they're standing on. I already understood what he meant, but I let him say it anyway. The lien had become the quiet center of everything now. Not because it was loud, because it was static. It didn't move. It didn't escalate. It just existed. And that was enough to force them into constant recalculation. Weston told me they were trying to challenge it procedurally, not on merit, on technicalities, paperwork arguments, delay tactics. If they can drag it out, he said, they can reduce its immediate pressure, but not remove it, I said. No, he admitted. Not unless they can invalidate the underlying work. And they can't. That was the key point. The structure held, which meant their only remaining option was behavior. And behavior always leaks. That's when I started noticing something else. The HOA wasn't just focused on me anymore. They were testing their own members. Inspection requests, notices expanded. Small violations started appearing everywhere. Wood piles, paint inconsistencies, driveway signage. Things that had existed for years suddenly became issues. It wasn't discipline, it was consolidation. They were trying to reassert internal control before the external. Situation collapsed into something they couldn't manage. And when organizations do that, they usually overcorrect. Struther came by again 2 days later. He didn't sit this time. He stood at the edge of the porch like he wasn't planning to stay long. She's pushing hard on the membership, he said. Define hard. People are getting letters almost weekly now. I nodded. And people are getting tired, he said. Not just annoyed, tired. That was important. Because annoyance creates resistance. Fatigue creates compliance. He looked at me directly. Some of them think you started this. I didn't start anything, I said. He didn't argue. He just nodded like that confirmed something he already suspected. Before he left, he said something quietly. The meeting's going to be ugly. I know, I said. He paused. Then added, she's planning something. I know that too. He looked like he wanted to say more but didn't. Then he walked back down the gravel path. That night, Weston called again. This time he didn't start with updates. He started with a warning. They filed for injunctive relief, he said. I stopped moving. Against what? Against your interference with HOA operations. I almost laughed. Almost. Interference, I repeated. Yes, he said. They're trying to frame your actions as obstructive to community access and governance. And the court, it's procedural at this stage, but it allows them to introduce urgency into the narrative. I looked out the window. The ridge was dark, no movement except wind in the trees. So they're trying to turn pressure into legitimacy, I said. Exactly. A pause. Then Weston added, but there's a problem for them. What's that? They're assuming you're going to respond through the same channels they're using. I didn't answer, because I already understood where this was going. Court filings, notices, hearings, all of it assumes participation, assumes engagement, assumes predictability. And I hadn't committed to any of that as my primary lever. I want you ready for Saturday, Weston said. I am. Another pause. Garrett, he said, this is going to become public. I know, and when it does, you need to stay controlled. I will. He didn't respond immediately. Then he said good, and hung up. The next 2 days passed without any new legal action, which was its own kind of signal. Because silence before a scheduled event is never neutral. It's staging. I spent most of that time observing, not acting, just reading behavior. Vehicles moving slower through the ridge, people pausing longer at mailboxes, conversations stopping when others approached. Everything had shifted into awareness. Like everyone knew something was coming, but no one had been told exactly what. On the morning before the meeting, I walked down to the creek. It was colder than usual. The water sounded sharper. I stood there for a while without thinking about anything specific, just listening, because I knew once the next day started, things would stop being observational and start being irreversible. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something I didn't expect. A vehicle parked near the edge of the road. Not HOA, not county, Weston. He stepped out before I reached him. We need to finalize something, he said. I nodded once. And that's when I realized the next stage wasn't going to be about argument anymore. It was going to be about presence. Because tomorrow, everyone would be in the same room. And whatever had been building quietly for weeks was finally going to become visible. The morning of the meeting felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, controlled quiet. The kind that happens when something large is already in motion but hasn't yet reached impact. Frost covered the gravel road in thin silver layers. The kind that disappears as soon as tires pass over it. The forest stood still, like it was holding its breath. Weston arrived before I finished loading the truck. He didn't say much when he stepped out. Just nodded once and handed me a leather folder. "Everything we need is in here," he said. I took it. It felt heavier than paper should. Not because of weight, because of consequence. We drove in silence for the first part of the trip. Not uncomfortable silence. Focused silence. The kind that happens when both people already understand the outcome is no longer about preparation. It's about execution. As we approached the Whitmore Ridge entrance road, I saw the first sign of tension. Vehicles, parked where they shouldn't be. A small cluster near the gate. People standing outside their cars. Talking. Waiting. Something had already disrupted the normal flow of movement. Weston looked out the windshield. "They've noticed the change," he said. I didn't respond, because I could already see it. The gate I had installed stood where it always had, but now it didn't feel like infrastructure. It felt like a boundary, a statement that had finally been read correctly. A deputy vehicle was parked off to the side, not blocking anything, just observing. The situation had already been translated into procedural awareness, not conflict, process. We didn't stop at the gate. We went the alternate route as planned, the overflow access road. Longer, less, direct, legally clean. By the time we arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already filling. People weren't rushing, but they weren't relaxed either. That in-between state where everyone is aware something is about to be addressed publicly. Inside, the room was set up like every HOA meeting I'd ever seen. Fold-out chairs, projector screen, a table at the front with microphones and printed agendas. But today, it didn't feel routine. It felt staged, like the room had been prepared for a specific outcome. And everyone had arrived early enough to witness it unfold. Weston leaned slightly toward me. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "I am calm," I replied. He gave me a look that suggested he knew. The difference between saying it and being it. Then he walked toward the back of the room, not the front, positioning himself where observation becomes leverage. I stayed standing near the side wall, not seated, not central, just present. That mattered more than it should have, because presence in rooms like this is a form of participation whether you speak or not. The meeting began on schedule. Pet Voss took the front. White Escalade energy translated into human form. Controlled posture, precise movements. A binder already open in front of her like she had rehearsed holding it that way. She started with standard agenda items. Road maintenance, community updates, budget summaries. But nobody was listening to those parts. Not really. Everyone was waiting for the shift, and she knew it. You could see it in the timing. She wasn't rushing. She was building towards something. Then she paused, looked up, and said, "We now need to address a serious matter involving external interference with community operations." There it was. The framing. She didn't say my name yet. She didn't need to, because every person in the room already knew who she meant. She continued. Over the next few minutes, she laid out her version of events. A narrative, not a timeline. A narrative, always shaped toward conclusion. Non-compliant property, obstructive behavior, financial exposure caused by outside influence. Each phrase carefully designed to shift perception rather than present fact. Then she did what I expected. She turned toward the audience. "As many of you know," she said, "this situation has escalated due to one adjacent property owner refusing to comply with community standards." That was the moment the room changed. Not loudly, quietly, people shifting in chairs, eyes moving toward the side of the room, toward me. I didn't move, because movement would have validated the framing, and I wasn't there to validate anything. She continued, and I let her. Because the more she spoke, the more she committed the narrative publicly. And public narratives have weight, but they also have records. Weston stood up at the back of the room, not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to shift attention. "Excuse me," he said. The room turned slightly, not fully, just enough. He walked forward, calm, controlled, document folder in hand. I'd like to place a few documents on the record before we continue. He didn't wait for permission. He placed copies on the front table, one for each board member, one for the podium, and one directly in front of Pet Voss. She looked at it without touching it at first. Like touching it might confirm it existed. "What is this?" she asked. Weston didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit. Then he said, "It's notice of lien assignment and access conditions regarding the parcel underlying your entrance road." The room shifted again, not emotionally, structurally, because people don't always understand legal language immediately, but they understand tone, and this tone was different. He continued, "It also includes documentation of a mechanic's lien currently held against this property's office parcel, and notice of intent to enforce said interest if conditions are not resolved." Now she looked at it. Actually. Looked. And I saw the exact moment understanding moved across her face. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Like a structure being read in reverse. One of the board members leaned in. "What does that mean?" someone asked. Weston answered without hesitation. "It means the entrance access to this community is governed by property rights tied to a parcel now under new ownership." A pause. Then he added, "And that owner is present in this room." That was the first time I moved. Not forward. Just slightly. Enough to acknowledge presence without claiming attention. The room found me anyway. Pet spoke again, her voice tighter now. "This is an attempt to extort the association." Weston shook his head once. "It's not extortion," he said calmly. "It's leverage, created entirely through public record transactions." She flipped through the document quickly now. Faster than before, like speed could undo comprehension. Then she stopped, because she had reached the part that mattered. The ownership chain, the lien record, the access conditions language, and I saw it again. That moment when a system realizes it has been mapped correctly by someone it underestimated. "This can't be enforced like this," she said. "It already is," Weston replied. A pause. Then he added, "The only question now is how you want to resolve it." Silence spread through the room. Not dramatic silence. Real silence. The kind where no one wants to be the first to misunderstand the situation out loud. From the back, someone finally spoke. "What are the options?" Weston turned slightly. "Resolution requires two things," he said. "One, acknowledgement that enforcement actions against the adjacent property will cease. Two, resolution of the outstanding lien obligation on this parcel." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because everything he was saying was already anchored in documentation. "This is insane," Pet said quietly. "No," I said for the first time. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "This is recorded." That word mattered more than anything else in the room. Recorded. Because recorded things don't rely on interpretation. They rely on existence. And existence is harder to argue with than opinion. Weston looked at the board. "We're not here to escalate," he said. "We're here to resolve." A pause. Then he added, "But resolution requires recognition of the actual structure you're operating under." No one spoke immediately. Because this was the moment everything shifted. Not in drama. In direction. And once direction changes, everything after it follows differently. Pet stood still at the front of the room, not speaking now, not moving, just holding the documents like they had weight she hadn't expected them to have. And for the first time since this started, the system wasn't speaking. It was listening. And that meant the next decision wouldn't come from pressure anymore. It would come from consequence. The room didn't explode into argument the way people expect in moments like this. It did something more uncomfortable. It went procedural. Phones came out, not for emotion, but for documentation. People leaned toward each other and spoke in low voices. A few stood up and then sat back down again, like they weren't sure whether standing would commit them to a side. That's when you know a room has changed, not when it gets loud. When it starts recording itself. Pet Voss was still standing at the front, but the authority she had walked in with wasn't holding the same shape anymore. It didn't vanish. It just stopped being accepted automatically. She looked at Weston, then at me, then back at the documents on the table like she expected them to rearrange themselves into something less final. "This is not how this works," she said again, but quieter this time. Weston didn't argue. He simply said, "It is how this works when it's recorded properly." That word again, recorded. It hung in the room heavier than anything else, because everyone. They're understood, even if they didn't fully follow the legal structure, that recorded systems don't bend easily to speeches. They bend to corrections. Or they don't bend at all. One of the board members finally spoke, not angrily, Carefully. What happens if we don't agree to this? Weston turned slightly toward him. Then nothing changes immediately, he said. But the lien remains, the access conditions remain, and the dispute moves entirely into enforcement and litigation cycles. A pause. And those are slower, he added, but not more favorable. That was the turning point, not because anyone liked the options, but because the illusion of a clean win had disappeared. Now there were only consequences, delayed or immediate, negotiated or enforced, but no version where nothing existed. Pet stepped forward slightly. You're using technicalities to destabilize a community, she said. I finally looked directly at her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity. No, I said. I'm using property rights you ignored while enforcing ones that never applied to me. That landed differently in the room, because it wasn't emotional, it was precise. And precision is harder to argue against than intensity. Weston placed one hand on the table. We can resolve this today, he said. Or we can formalize it in court over the next several months. But the underlying facts won't change. Silence again. This one longer, less comfortable. Then something shifted from the back of the room. Not a board member, a homeowner. Then another, and another. Small voices at first, asking the same underlying question in different forms. Is this legal? What does this mean for access? Can we still use the road? Because once people realize the system is no longer stable, their concern stops being about who is right and becomes about what continues to function. And roads are very good at focusing people, because everyone uses them. One of the older residents spoke up. So what? Are we supposed to do right now? Weston didn't hesitate. Right now, he said, you do nothing. Access remains available under current conditions. This is not blockade. It is a legal notice of rights and obligations tied to property ownership. He paused, but it does require acknowledgement. That word mattered. Acknowledgement is where systems either stabilize or collapse. Because acknowledging something makes it real in a way denial cannot undo. Pet looked around the room like she was trying to find where the consensus had gone. But consensus doesn't disappear. It just redistributes. And right now, it was moving away from control and toward continuity. She spoke again, but the edge was gone. This is retaliation, she said. Weston shook his head. It's documentation. A pause. Then he added, retaliation would be emotional. This is structural. That distinction ended more arguments in that room than anything else. Because structural problems don't respond to speeches. They respond to resolution. Or they remain. By the time the meeting started breaking into side conversations, the outcome wasn't declared. It didn't need to be. People were already adjusting to the reality that had been introduced. Not that anything had been taken away, but that control was conditional. And condition changes everything. Weston gathered the documents slowly. No urgency now, no performance. Just closure of procedure. As people began leaving the room in clusters, I stayed where I was for a moment. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to see what after looked like. Pet remained at the front, still holding one of the papers, no longer addressing anyone. Just reading, rereading, trying to find a version of it that softened the meaning. But recorded things don't soften, they just remain. Outside, the air felt colder than it had that morning. The parking lot was less chaotic now, more divided. Groups talking in small circles, trying to reestablish certainty through conversation. Weston walked up beside me. That will settle, he said quietly. It already is, I replied. He nodded once, not in agreement. In confirmation. Because we both knew the difference between resolution and acceptance. Resolution is written. Acceptance takes longer. We started walking toward the truck. Behind us, the community center door opened again. And again, people leaving slowly now, adjusting, recalculating, not just the situation, but what they thought they understood about the ground they were standing on. As we reached the truck, Weston stopped briefly. One more thing, he said. I looked at him. The lien gets resolved through payment and release filing, he continued. Once that's recorded, everything reverts to standard access. I nodded. I know. He studied me for a moment. Then said, you didn't use it beyond what was necessary. I didn't respond immediately. Because that wasn't the point I had been operating from. Eventually, I said, it was never about blocking them. Weston nodded again. It was about making them see the structure they were standing on. We got into the truck. And as we pulled away from Whitmore Ridge, I saw the gate in the distance. Still there. Still open, but no longer unnoticed, because now everyone understood it wasn't just a gate, it was a reminder. That land doesn't respond to authority. It responds to ownership. And ownership is always recorded before it is respected.